Well, good morning or afternoon or wherever you are in this world. My name is Tracey Welson-Rossman, founder of Journal My Health, and I'm here with my good friend Joyce Griggs, who is the founder of the United States of Healthcare. We're very, very excited today to have Cynthia Adinig as our guest. And I met Cynthia at a conference in December, and I just loved what she is doing. Unfortunately, under not great circumstances. So Cynthia is a marketing specialist, and unfortunately has become a long COVID and MECFS advocate, an equity policy advisor. She has been recovering from long COVID since March of 2020. So she's one of the early folks. And she has been part of many projects, including planning and speaking at the Invisible Disability Panel with the Massachusetts Department of Public Health. And she's been a speaker at many other conferences, along with the one that I was at where I met her. She wrote a digital emergency room guide for long haulers of color to increase their access of care. And she is now has launched the BIPOC Equity Agency. And that is a multidisciplinary consulting agency advancing racial equity and support for underserved communities. And she has founded this with several partners who are all women of color who have had long COVID and other chronic issues.
So we're back with Cynthia for the second part of our conversation, where we're going to talk about healthcare views from the BIPOC community, and really talk about specifically maternal healthcare, which we know in the U.S. is atrocious, is the word that comes to mind. The most recent data that we have from 2020 shows again that maternal mortality is on the increase in the U.S., no matter your background, but that burden is disproportionately really carried by Black women in particular. But just to give us all a point of view, among the industrialized nations, the U.S., our maternal mortality is about 3 times higher than that of the next highest countries, which are Canada and France, among industrialized Western nations. So it is a big problem, and it's specifically a big problem for women of color. So can you tell us then a little bit, Cynthia, about your journey from a Black woman's perspective? I mean, I know you have some stories for us.
Unfortunately, yes. So long COVID was not my first bad experience in that space of healthcare. And you would think that it would prep me to not be shocked by what I experienced with long COVID. But I feel like you have to have a little bit of denial as a Black person in America in order to function, and a little denial about how progressive and safe you are as a person of color in this country. So yeah, when I was pregnant with my son, it was such a nightmare because, I ended up getting diagnosed with hyperemesis gravidarum, which is basically like having morning sickness, but all day, all night. And I had that basically until I had him. I was on bed rest for a while. It was a very painful experience. I was in pain every single day that I was pregnant with him. I had a few ER trips when I was pregnant with him that I now can see was like some POTS and MCAS stuff that I'm now diagnosed with. But things were missed, like my EDS was missed. There were so many things missed when I was pregnant with him that contributed to my suffering and having a really difficult pregnancy. And when I was in labor with him, I was talking to the nurses about how I noticed he didn't like it when I laid on my left side. And folks who have been pregnant know that the doctors are always telling you to the baby does best on the left, they digest better, sleep on your left. But I noticed early on that he didn't like it. And so I told them that while I was in labor. And they were like, well, let's try it. Let's try it anyways. I was like, he really feels uncomfortable and distressed. I really don't want to do it. But the nurses talked me into doing it. And then when I laid over on my left-hand side, they were like, his heart rate went down. And the nurse was like, oh, wow, that's really bad. Let's not do that. And I was like, well, can you make a note to anyone that comes afterwards, not to ask me to be on my left-hand side, because clearly there's something wrong. And they're like, okay, fine. And then of course, shift change comes in a couple hours. New nurse comes in. All right, it's time to lay on your left side. And I'm like, we just did this. His heart rate went down. I can tell you, he really does not like being on his left-hand side. Can we not do this? Is there some other way that we can get my blood flowing from that epidural? I know what you're trying to do, but there's got to be another way we can do this that doesn't involve me being on my left side. And they were like, oh, well, let's just try it. And so I'm like, I really don't want to do this, but okay. And I did it again. And so that happened several times, at least 4 times. And so by the time I'm 24 hours into labor, 10 centimeters dilated, and they're like, oh, well, we now have to give a C-section because his heart rate is unstable. And I'm like, but you're the reason why his heart rate is unstable. I could have had a natural birth without, with a vaginal, not natural, but a vaginal birth, if you guys had actually listened to me in the first place. His heart rate was fine whenever you weren't flipping me over to my left-hand side. And so that was really, really frustrating. They often would refer to me, even though my husband was in the room, they would refer to me as if I wasn't married as well. I noticed that so often, and not just because he's Asian, just because, that stereotype, in spite of the fact that I have a very big ring, that Black women are not, wed mothers. I could tell they just defaulted to it. Like they weren't looking for cues to say, is she or is she not, like you would a white woman, right? They would just default to, okay, Black woman, unwed, this is just her partner or whatever, not her spouse. And so that's one of the things. And of course, my IV line infiltrated in my arm after giving birth to him. They did not notice it at all. And I had to alert them several hours into it. My arm was swelling, hurt so bad I could barely hold him because they didn't notice that my IV was not stilling properly. So those are just some of the things that I experienced. And so I'm like, I can see why we have maternal mortality, because you're not paying attention to the fact that my arm is twice the size it should be. And of course, you're putting my baby in distress and not caring or looking at the notes or believing me when I say it multiple times that it's putting him in distress. Then it explains the maternal mortality. And who knows what other issues our Black children are experiencing negatively from these negative experience in labor. I've found that these spaces are vastly understructured for reporting these incidents. So we could not have the data of what the longitudinal effects of the non-death that comes from Black women in that space that are happening to our children. Something we should definitely dig into.
Cynthia, I think it's important, we just talked about the stats, and then you told your story, but you are a magnet, for good or for bad, of stories like this. So can you give us a sense of that this is not just you, of other stories that you may have heard? And I think we're trying to stay within the bounds of the maternal discussion, because I think if we opened it up more, we would be here for a while.
Yeah.
So
Unfortunately.
If you have any other stories that you might be able to share.
I don't have any specific stories, but when I talk to the other moms, most Black moms have some story, especially in our space where we talk to each other a lot more, some story. And I think the good part about long COVID is that it opened up a lot of us who were carrying these stories quietly to actually talk about them. So I knew the prevalence and the stats and about, other celebrities that have the similar stories, but it's not something that we discuss, and I think I think it kind of plays into the culture of Black women, and especially in women of color in general, silently enduring and the expectation that we're going to experience. I know that I knew early on in life, I expected violent racism to be upon me very early on in life because my parents taught me about all that could happen when I went to the school system. So I expected it. And so I felt like it was part of the experience being a Black woman in this space. And it sadly, unfortunately, is. But so it's not something, when something is that regular and that normalized, it's not something that we really raise alarms about, because we just know that it's going to happen. And we don't really have a lot of recourse in what to do about it. And being in the long COVID space, especially with a group of us that almost died together, we have a lot more vulnerable conversations about our life experience pre-COVID. And they were telling me that they experienced a lot, especially the issue with those of us that are, married, having those microaggressions about referring to us as if we are actually married, and as if we actually have a partner, and having a support system and being listened to during our pregnancy when something happens or in a follow-up. A lot of us have undiagnosed PCOS, and it's not for us not having the symptoms pre-COVID. It's just that no one cared enough to diagnose us.
Right. So it just
that
builds into it.
So much much PCOS.
So it's interesting because, as we're doing our work in Journal My Health, we're really beginning to see all the tie-ins of these multiple chronic issues that are centered around autoimmune issues. But we're not here to talk about that. What I would like to get from your standpoint, as we close out this segment, and I know that we could talk, for hours on this, short-term changes that can be made. And then if you have any ideas around that, and I would try and, and then long-term changes, and the longer term changes, I'm feeling they're going to be much longer term, but let's talk a little bit of maybe 3 short-term changes that you would love to see to help Black women and women of color on their maternal journeys, and then maybe 2 longer term changes.
Yeah, I think one thing that would help a lot is that same structure of what we're kind of seeing in the MECFS long COVID space, which is almost like a mentorship space where a pregnant mom has someone who's been through that space to be with, to say, this is what care should look like. I'm finding that because communities of color have been so pushed out of the space of healthcare historically, even when we're not getting necessarily bad care, we don't know what good care looks like, because this is the first time we're getting any care. So to set that bar of expectations, I think another person of color should be available to the new moms of color to know what's right, what's wrong, what they're lying to you about, what tests that they can and cannot do. Super important to have, like around the clock. I developed it really was a team, a support system team of nurses that helped me in that early, nurses with MECFS chronic illness that helped me in those early days. AI, I've given this so much thought. AI that pops up when certain not want to say complications, but certain abnormalities happen in labs, or if a patient talks about certain things in their in the appointment. I
Right.
think if we got AI to pop up and say, hey, this person sounds like they're experiencing this, and then another piece of AI that reminded them, like if that doctor, if that person had another, not emergency visit, but just more strenuous pregnancy, if an AI system would like do a pop-up of that doctor in that appointment and say, hey, people of color are often
Right.
overlooked in diagnosis, double check this person to make sure that they're actually okay, like reminding them in the moment that they could be brushing off our concerns
Right.
too soon. I think AI, like we need something to take it out of the hands of doctors, like arbitrarily, because as we're seeing, they're defaulting to just not caring enough to really dig in and tell us that. But then also, I've noticed a lot of us are getting doulas that are of color. And so having a wider like advertising of the option of having a doula of color with you would also set up that whole mentorship
So that could
experience.
be right. So that's like another piece of the mentorship program.
Exactly,
And then the
exactly.
AI, the question I have that we can explore later is, is there enough data around a Black woman's maternal experience, not just, in labor, but through the 9 months to create that AI. So that may be, there may be two steps to that is who's collecting that data, is it out there? And then from there, who could create an AI? So that would be, I'm going to put that in the longer term discussion, but it does make a lot of sense.
I've given it a lot of thought of how to fix it, a lot of thought. I rack my brain with it all the time about what can we do? How can we stop these unnecessary deaths? Because I know these deaths are happening. We just don't know. And you're right about the data, and that's something that I think about. And that's why one of the things that I have been championing to members of Congress this entire time, whenever we're doing long COVID legislation, is something called a disparity index score for any healthcare space. And I feel like if we got a standardized disparity index score in which we kind of forced their hand of the healthcare system to report when they get reports of racial bias, then we can actually look at just how widely it's impacting all of healthcare, not just maternal mortality, not just long COVID, but all of the times that we're visiting, and it's causing death by 1,000 cuts to us along the way, lowering our life expectancy and harming families, because when you go undiagnosed for that long, that affects your employment, that affects your ability to play with your child. So there's so many ways that
I mean, the onion on that
factors.
is just huge because, and then there's just costs in general if we want to, just put it in an economic sense.
Yes.
So I think I love what you've come up with. You've got two short-term, really, I wonder, how we could actually work on this, but creating these mentorship or guides along the way, and then increasing the use of doulas, in the delivery space. Those are not technology. That's not legislation. That is people. And then we're talking longer term, some legislation, some government intervention, and then also some, technology. So really, it's just showing us that it is a mix of things to start bringing this. So, I wish that we had more time, and maybe we can have you come back and we could talk about some other issues and around, specifically BIPOC women. I think we have to, open up a little bit more,
Mm-hmm.
and make it well known, because that's how we create innovation. Whether it is something as simple as connections, and I don't want to, simple is simple, but connections, legislation, technology, is, ways that we can solve some of these issues. So I really, really appreciate your time. I know this is exertion.
Yeah.
And if you, did not see the first part of our discussion with Cynthia, please go, take a look as we talk about, support systems for people who have autoimmune issues, long COVID, other long-term chronic issues, and as it affects your family as well. So I think they're really important conversations for us to have. So thank you so much. And
Thanks for having me.
we can have you back on.
Cool. Sounds awesome. I'm so glad that the space is happening. It's so needed. And one of my goals in this space is to be one of those voices that is vulnerable about my struggles along the way, because there's not enough of that available, especially for Black women, to say, hey, I'm struggling, I need support. It's okay, you're not failing to need support. And especially with long COVID, if you don't delegate and get that support that you need, you're never going to recover. Right. So learning to give myself grace for the amount of time that I need to recover and the amount of support that I need has been something I had to learn along the way. And I'm so happy to have a platform to help other women of color feel more comfortable with giving themselves grace as they recover.